Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel in particular. And I'm sure because there's lots of great panels going on at the same time, so thank you. I should warn you that I am at risk of rambling, so I'm going to look around and you can just nod at me or something. Okay, so as Kamal said, my name is Hirah and I'm with the University of Southampton. I generally, in my research, I've just started to look at extremist narratives and counter-extremist narratives, and so that's where this idea took root. I initially began by wondering how the Taliban's narratives looked like after takeover and after US withdrawal from the US. And the Taliban really does offer an excellent case study to examine social media strategy for two reasons, essentially. One is that this lack of cohesion in social media platforms policies. So while Taliban is banned on banned on Facebook, it's allowed on Twitter as long as posts and accounts adhere to rules around hate speech and incitement to violence. And in fact, Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid and the UN ambassador-elect Suhail Shaheen have over 600,000 followers on Twitter. I mean, this has grown exponentially over the past 6 months as well, 6 to 8 months. And so the second reason was just to look at this post-takeover pursuit of inward and outward legitimacy and narrative building that the Taliban have seemed to be doing. And so the original paper was supposed to be about how official and pro-Taliban accounts on Twitter developed their social media strategy and narratives in the pursuit of this legitimacy. And I was going to look at sharing of mainstream narratives, multimedia content, the adoption of this very careful neutral tone, and also the use of different languages and different platforms for specific target audiences. Now, during that time, of course, there's been a lot written about this, and in fact, BBC Monitoring has done a whole breakdown of the various narratives the Taliban has adopted over the past 9 months or so. But I do feel like these are all meant to have a legitimizing effect, right? And we can kind of agree around that to some extent, although whether or not they are successful, and this is another paper, for now we can say that in many respects, the impetus for some of the newer more progressive narratives is political rather than ideological. And so, like I said, this has been covered by various researchers, and so I really am going to focus more on how the Taliban has used different languages. So just a brief overview of what the literature has already covered, which is that the Taliban post-takeover has seemed to have very specific priorities. First is maintaining internal cohesion in the face of both internal and external threats. Second is presenting a credible image of an independent Islamic Afghanistan, free from external and occupying influence, especially from the United States. Maintaining ideological legitimacy at the same time among supporters, while also building credibility amongst the Afghan population about its ability to govern the country, which is beset by a lot of problems. And perhaps most of all, establishing legitimacy in the eyes of the world as rulers of Afghanistan, as a legitimate government. And so official and pro-Taliban social media strategy includes tailoring its messaging based on the language and platform used and adopting newer practices. So, for example, shitposting, using memes. We've seen this immediately after US withdrawal. We saw, a lot of things written about how memes were being used by people in support of the Taliban, whether or not they were based in Afghanistan. We really don't know. And so, in terms of narratives, so there are three main narratives that the Taliban has adopted or has been pushing over the past few months. Narrative of victory over the occupiers, so the United States, and continued criticism of US leadership, and also looking ahead, like what now, what next, who do we build partnerships with, women's rights, namely that women are thriving and empowered, and the idea that they're not has been actually created by the West rather than a reality, and legitimacy as rulers of this country that is both progressive and also firmly rooted in Islamic law. I've included two images here. So one is this Wojak meme where a Taliban member is being criticized in many ways, and the guy just responds with yes, and a group of women behind him telling him they've prepared dinner, right, as a response to, well, you say this, but look how we're thriving, right? This is a great arrangement. And the second was taken from the Twitter, the official Taliban Twitter account in Urdu, shared very recently, with a Taliban soldier all geared up, holding a skull that looks like an American flag in his left hand and a gun in his right, saying, this image is in response to what Trump says about us, and this means that America and its followers are in our left hand. So essentially, no sweat for us, right? We can just, it's nothing for us. We don't even need our right hand to combat them. So this is some of the stuff that pro-Taliban accounts have been posting quite frequently. So I really kind of wanted to look at what sort of narratives the Taliban produces in relatively non-native languages, right? And so of the 5 languages they post in, Dari, Pashto, English, Arabic, and Urdu, of course, English, Arabic, and Urdu, how many people in Afghanistan are actually speaking or using those languages or consuming content in those languages? So official Taliban media is maintained in 5 languages, Dari, Pashto, Arabic, English, and Urdu. The websites, the Voice of Jihad websites, are quite creaky, difficult to navigate, but they do seem to have content being pushed sort of simultaneously and identical content. So it's quite well managed in that respect. But the key sort of interaction and engagement is on Twitter, where the Taliban maintains official media accounts, Al-Imara, in all of these languages. And so I looked at the Twitter accounts in English and Arabic. So there's a huge, like you can tell, there's a huge difference between the number of followers. A lot more followers for the Arabic account, although they are quite active. The English one is quite active as well. So what might be the purpose of these accounts, right? And this is fairly, I think, fairly clear for us to understand. English content targets the international community. Messages attempt to portray the Afghan Taliban movement as a legitimate political organization and frame its existence around claims of victimization, while also sort of reiterating that the group's military and political objectives are very much Afghanistan-based. The Arabic account it feels like it's used to continue attracting support from Gulf countries, predominantly like financial support, but also sort of political support, and maintain its legitimacy as an entity that adheres to Islamic law and Islamic principles. And it does tend to share a lot of like mainstream Arab media narratives, a lot of Al Jazeera Arabic content being posted there, being retweeted. So I focused largely on the Urdu content. I was especially intrigued by it because of its large number of followers and the fact that it is very active. And there was some overlap with the other Twitter accounts, but you did find like some things in this account that just didn't exist in the other ones, which was anti-Pakistan military rhetoric, significantly more ideological messaging, such as how great it is that Afghanistan has established a Sharia-compliant financial system, actively engaging with pro-Taliban accounts, of which there are many in Urdu, and with retweeting and liking and certain tweets. So it really does kind of look more like a pro-Taliban account run by someone in Pakistan, sympathetic to the Taliban and the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, although obviously there's no way of really knowing that. And Taliban production and dissemination of content, I should add, in Urdu isn't, of course, new. It has periodically translated material from and to Urdu over the past couple of decades. And this published material is both anti-Western and anti-Pakistani state, right? So it targets Pakistani Pashtuns and other ethnic groups who would be more receptive to that kind of content. And so, just to briefly, these narratives are sort of centered on anti-US sentiment, and it appeals to many Pakistanis who hold the US responsible for perhaps forcing Pakistan into the so-called war on terror and turning it into a target for terrorism, for homegrown terrorism, I should say. And narratives criticizing Pakistan's military are pushed exclusively for a Baloch and Pashtun audience within Pakistan. The account also routinely praises Pakistani relief efforts in Pakistan's acceptance of Afghan refugees, and also criticizes India for some of this sort of deviance, I would say, from what the Taliban considers good social norms. So it's really quite a mixed one. And so this I thought was quite interesting. So it's a Pakistani cricketer who posts something about Pervez Musharraf, who was the former Pakistani president, and the Taliban commander, General Mubin Khan, writes, exactly, he's true son of the country, and well, you can read it. And so this account then retweets that and gets a lot of likes and says, well, this is great because, yeah, this guy was horrible, and this guy is someone who's a shared enemy of both the Taliban and the Pakistani people. I would say the backdrop to this, of course, is the TTP problem, which is the Taliban continues to maintain a close relationship with the anti-state TTP, anti-Pakistani state TTP. There's continued support for the TTP, which has murdered Pakistani civilians and battled with the military for years and seeks to establish sort of hardline interpretation of Sharia in Pakistan. It also has close ideological bonds and tribal affiliations with certain parts of the TTP, so especially because of the Haqqani network. But the TTP is generally sort of discredited, if not reviled, by most Pakistanis, right? And so it feels very much like some of this messaging is trying to shore up support for some of the narratives that the TTP also pushes out. And this sort of perception of an effective Islamic leadership in Afghanistan might actually lend credibility to the TTP in Pakistan. So that kind of explains why there's so much messaging being pushed out in Urdu, targeting Pakistanis, maybe trying to shore up support for the TTP, perhaps. And of course, one of the Taliban's biggest problems is the Islamic State, which is, and this is a rivalry that's not just centered on the battle for territory, but also recruitment. So it's difficult to determine how many defections there have been on either side, but there's anecdotal evidence that members of the Afghan National Army have been recruited or have been, the ISK seeks to recruit them, united in their dislike for the Taliban. There are also reports that since August of last year, large numbers of foreign fighters from the Middle East, Central Asia, and also Pakistan have gone to Afghanistan to join the Islamic State. In February, I think, this year, the Taliban arrested 2 British citizens who tried to cross the border to join the Islamic State via Uzbekistan. So clearly that's going on. And so there's a real sort of, we need to be pushing out more narratives about that would attract those sort of people to us rather than those. And so there are reportedly about 400 ISK foreign fighters as of now, although, again, these figures are always really difficult to determine. And it's not just recruitment, so there's also the battle for hearts and minds. This is tied closely to the socioeconomic conditions in Afghanistan, which has been teetering on the brink of economic collapse well before U.S. withdrawal, but also particularly since U.S. withdrawal last year. But also ideological legitimacy, right? So the ISK has been establishing ties with local militant groups, all in pursuit of that jihadi alliance, people who consider perhaps groups that consider the Taliban not jihadist enough or conforming to international norms, and has also tried to recruit from those communities that are disenfranchised or feel disenfranchised. And within its own messaging, ISK routinely criticizes the Taliban, of course, for links to the Pakistani military, for selling out its ideological values for the sake of international legitimacy. They call the Taliban apostates, and now they target the failed governance in Afghanistan, or what they perceive to be failed governance. So I'm conscious of the fact that I've probably taken too much of your time, but the key takeaways, I'm good. That's a relief. So yeah, so I mean, there are very real implications for jihadism or the future of jihadism in the region. It's not going away anytime soon, I think, and it's getting messier and messier, and these rivalries will pan out. But it will be interesting to see what kind of narratives how the narratives evolve over time, right? And so how the Taliban takes Afghanistan forward, what its foreign policy looks like, and particularly what happens with Pakistan, what happens with the TTP in Pakistan, because I think that's really sort of central to how certainly the rivalry with ISK pans out. And you know, looking at content, so I'm a huge fan of looking at content in non-English or languages that you'd really find things in that you wouldn't. I mean, it's also a content moderation issue, right? So unless you can look at some of this content in the language it was posted in, and you understand the context, and you understand why certain things are being said and why certain things are being pushed at a certain time, you don't really, I think, get the whole very comprehensive understanding of it. And so that was really what was the impetus for this rambly paper. So I feel like this creates looking at these different languages, and this I focused on Urdu, but certainly I think there's a lot of scope for looking at the Taliban's account in Arabic, which has a lot more followers than the Urdu one. And the sharing of a lot of Al Jazeera content is fascinating to me. But yeah, so I feel like this provides a more comprehensive understanding of the group's social media strategy. It offers insights into how an extremist group uses multiple streams of narratives to establish legitimacy in the eyes of different actors, which is why I feel the Taliban is such a great case study for this. And yeah, more effective content moderation at the end of the day, which is if we know what's being said, then we can figure out what is bad enough to take down. So, yeah, thank you for your time. I'll hand over to you.